write an equation to match the graph below in terms of both sine and cosine. As I look at this picture, the first thing that I notice is that the midline of this graph is not along the x-axis. So I'm going to pull out my highlighter and put in where I think the midline is, which is here, and then go back and check it. And what I notice on here, if you count from that midline, you can go up 1, 2 to the highest point, or you can go count down 2 to the lowest point. And because it's both up 2 and down 2, I know that I do have my midline correct. And in fact, one of those things that tells me is that the vertical displacement on this graph is that we're going to have down 1. And in fact, when I'm working on the equation, the first thing that I do is I put down 1 in there right away. But kind of confusing right now, so I think I'll erase that. But we've got down 1, we've got that. And what we also just said is that we counted above that highlighted line and below that highlighted line, and that gave us an amplitude of 2, which is also our A value. As we take a look at the graph, I'm going to start along the y-axis, and it's here, and then when we've completed one cycle of the graph, we end up over here, and that looks like, as I read the graph, that above that far right point, the period is going to be 8 pi. And to figure out, then, what our B value is, what we have to do is we have to take 2 pi divided by 8 pi. And 2 pi divided by 8 pi will give us 1/4. For our first graph here, we're not going to have a value for C. And we do have our vertical displacement of the down 1. Once again, you might put -1, or you might just put 1 in there. But as we go back and look at the picture, and I fill in a couple more points on this graph, the equation that I'm going to write first is going to be a cosine function, a cosine equation. And so let's put in the down 1 there. We know that our amplitude is 2, so it's going to be 2 cosine. And then we can actually fill in the rest here. We can put the 1/4. There's our B value in. But we do need to take into account one more thing as you take a closer look at this picture. Normally when we start with cosine, we say cosine of 0 is +1. Well, what happens is that we didn't go above that line, we went below that line. And because of that, the other transformation that we have is that we reflected this graph over the x-axis. Again, because we started below the aqua line instead of above it. So that means that we need to have our negative in front of the cosine function. Now again, so there's the first equation, and we can type it into the calculator to check. I'm not going to spend my time on that now, but that's something that you could do. But our other equation, for the sine equation, is going to have a phase shift in it. The thing about the sine equation is that the 2 isn't going to change. It might be negative and it might be positive. We don't know yet. Sine, the sine function, we're still going to have the 1/4 x, but leave a little bit more space. And then we're going to have the -1 over here. And remember, there's lots of ways that you can write this equation, but I'm going to find a place where I can write my sine function. So I need to find a sine curve in this graph. And I'm going to go here. I'm going to say that the sine is here, 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 and then if we had a little bit more space, it would end up over here. So there's a sine curve. And the nice thing is, I've got starting here at 2 pi negative 1, and then I went up. So my 2 in front of the sign is going to remain positive. We don't reflect it for this graph. But what we do have is we do have a phase shift. And we're going to be putting in our C value here, but we went right, so that means we're going to go minus. And then to calculate out our phase shift, we're going to do C divided by B, which is the 1/4, and that's going to equal our phase shift of 2 pi. Oh, not 24, 2 pi. Then we're going to multiply this side by 1/4. We're going to multiply this side by 1/4. And 1/4 cancel out. We really get C equals 2 pi divided by 4, which is pi over 2. And then we can fill that in. That's our C value, is the pi over 2. Again, we went minus because we went to the right, pi over 2. And on second thought, let's type this into our calculator and see if we do have the correct value. So we'll type in y equals 2 sine of 1/4 x minus pi over 2 minus 1. And then our cosine function, negative 2 cosine of 1/4 x close the parentheses, minus 1. So our window here, on our picture, we went from negative 8 pi to positive 8 pi. And our increment on the graph is 2 pi. And then we went from negative 5 to positive 2 on our picture. There's the sine graph, and there the cosine graph lands right on top of it. So we should be okay. I'm not going to do that for the other problems necessarily, but that's something that you can use to self-check as you're working through this packet and as you're taking your test. So it's the same thing here on problem number 6. We're going to write an equation to match the graph in terms of both sine and cosine. And once again, we need to find the midline. So we take a glance at this, and what we're trying to figure out is where's the line where it's going to be the same value above and below. And if we draw it wrong, the thing is we can always erase. We can move that. But as I look above, I'm counting 1, 2, 3 to the highest point. And as I look below, 1, 2, 3 to the lowest point. So we do have our midline correct here. And in this particular case, then what that tells us is that we went up 2. And that also, then, because we went 3 above that highlighted line and 3 below that highlighted line, that means our amplitude is going to be 3. When we start this graph here, I'm going to start it at this particular point, and then here's a middle value and an end value, and then we went above and below. That picture looks like a sine function, so we're going to do sine first in this case. And we need to come up with our period. And what we see there is when we finished this graph, we ended at 16. So our period is 16. And then we want to figure out, well, what is our B value? And to figure that out, we're going to take 2 pi divided by b, which is 16, and that gives us pi over 8. We're not going to have a c value for our first function because there typically is no phase shift in the first function, and c has to do with phase shift, but we do have the up to, so I'm going to put the d in there. And we can start putting together our sine equation now. Y equals 3 sine pi divided by 8x plus 2. We had everything that we needed. Take a quick glance back at the equation to make sure that we don't need to reflect somehow, but we do not need to reflect. And that's our equation for sine. And once again, when we get to cosine, then this 3 isn't going to change. It might become negative, but that 3 is not going to change. And cosine is going to be there. And pi over 8x isn't going to change, but leave more space in your parentheses because we are going to have a phase shift. And it's just a matter of where are we moving our graph. So in this particular case, and remember, there's multiple answers. I happen to look at my cosine function as here, 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 and here as those red points, which means that I moved my graph to the left. So left is going to be plus. So our phase shift, I moved it left 4. Get this, say this eventually. And the phase shift is C divided by B, which is pi over 8. And it equals our value of 4. So when we solve this equation, we're going to multiply by pi over 8 here. We're going to multiply by pi over 8 here. The pi over 8's cancel out. And what we end up with then is we end up with c equals 4 pi over 8, which is really pi over 2. And we can throw that in. Well, let's take a look at one more thing here on the graph. I started my cosine curve, the farthest to the left red point, underneath the aqua highlighted line. So I do need to add in a negative on this function to make sure that those two graphs match. And again, that's something that you can type in, and certainly if you're typing it in and you forget that, that's an easy fix. You can look at it and you go, oh, I almost have the right graph, but I need to do one more thing to that graph. One more time. If we write an equation to match the graph below in terms of both sine and cosine, as I take a quick look at this graph, I see that the high point is at 5 and the low point is at -5, which means that we don't have to have a new midline on this. We know that our amplitude is 5. As I start this graph, I'll start right here at the origin and look at some points. And what it looks like to me is that our period is 2. So we can figure out what the b value of this function is by taking 2 pi divided by our period, which gives us pi. And that's going to tell us our b value here, pi. We also know that the amplitude is 5. We're not going to have a c in here for now, nor are we going to have a d in here. Some people put 0, some people put not applicable. But as I look at that picture where I have those green points, what that looks like to me is a sine function. So I'm going to start by graphing or start by the sine function, and we have everything that we need. It's going to be 5 sine of pi x. But even though I don't have a highlighted line in, again, I want to point out, if I did have a highlighted line in, it would be right along the x-axis. And when we first graphed, we went under that highlighted line instead of above that highlighted line, which ultimately means that we have reflected this graph over the x-axis. So we need to have a negative in front of the 5. Now when we get to the cosine function, again, certain things aren't going to change. This 5 is not going to change. It might be positive or it might be negative. We're going to have cosine for this function. The pi x isn't going to change, but we just need to have some space on here to determine whether we're adding or subtracting. And it just is a matter of where you choose to move your graph. And I actually, when I look at the cosine function, I'm looking here at where I just put those blue points. There's my cosine curve. So in terms of our phase shift, I move this graph left, and it looks like left 0.5, which I will probably use 1/2. So now that we know that we move this left 0.5 or 1/2, again, I'm going to use the 1/2. Our phase shift is C divided by B. Remember, we found the fact that the B value is pi. And I'm going to put in the 1/2. So what we do is we multiply the left side by pi, and we multiply the right side by pi. And we get C equals pi over 2. Again, we went left, so we're going to say plus, and then it's going to be pi over 2, which I forget to write that in sometimes. And then the last thing that we want to check is, do we need to reflect anything? And we started above that highlighted line, so we don't need a reflection. And again, I recommend that you check your pictures on the calculator. I know that I'm not spending that time right now, but check them on the calculator before you turn in your test, before you finish your study packet.